Welcome to the Exploring Unschooling podcast. For countless parents, the journey to unschooling has redefined childhood and transformed their family relationships. Are you curious? Together, let's explore what living and learning looks like without school. Hello, explorers. I'm Pam Laricchia, and it's the 18th of May, 2022, as I record this intro. This week, we're flashing back to episode 84, Enjoy Parenting with Scott Noelle. Scott is an unschooling dad of two, and we spoke back in 2017. He's also an author and a life coach dedicated to supporting parents who want to move away from control-based parenting methods. He founded The Daily Groove, an email newsletter and website where he shared practical parenting insights for many years. We talked about his parenting framework, path, the value of nonverbal communication, ways we can hold presence with negative feelings, and how fear can slip into control. Now, there's a fun connection for me that I thought I'd share. In the Living Joyfully Network, our theme this month is the richness of communication, and as we've been exploring this idea through the lens of compassion, I talked about the immense value of seeing things through my child's eyes. It's a layer deeper than the usual adage of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, because when I think of putting myself in my child's shoes, while I may better see the situation from their perspective, I'm still using my own eyes, which means I'm still looking at things through the lens of my lived experiences, my likes and dislikes, my aspirations and fears. So instead, trying to see things through my child's eyes reminds me that my child has different life experiences, different likes and dislikes, different aspirations and fears than I do, which often means their experience in this moment is very different than mine would be in their shoes. So it was really fun to see that in our conversation, Scott shared a great little game to help us make this deeper shift. Here's what he said. You can actually play thought games and decide for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be my child. I'm going to fully and wholeheartedly inhabit the perspective of my child. If they love something that I think is meh, then I'm going to love it. Just feel that. And that opens you up to discovering deeper kinds of connection, but also just things where, you know what, my opinion about that one thing wasn't fully informed. Now that I've fully stepped into my child's world, I have a greater appreciation of that. I love that. And I encourage you to try inhabiting your child's perspective, seeing through their eyes this week, maybe for 15 or 20 minutes, and see what you discover. It can definitely be an incredibly enlightening experience. So whether you're revisiting my conversation with Scott or it's your first time listening, I hope you enjoy it. I'm pretty sure you'll make a new connection or two that will help deepen your understanding of unschooling. And before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has chosen to support the podcast through Patreon. I deeply appreciate all my patrons. Your generous support is instrumental in keeping the podcast archive freely available to anyone who's curious and wants to explore the fascinating world of unschooling. If you'd like to join my community of patrons and scoop up some great rewards along the way, check out the Exploring Unschooling page at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/exploring unschooling. And now, please enjoy my conversation with Scott. Hi everyone, I'm Pam Laricchia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Scott Noelle. Hi Scott.
Hey Pam, it's really good to talk to you finally.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you on. I'm very excited. For people who may not know, Scott is an unschooling dad of two teenagers, an author, and a life coach dedicated to supporting parents who want to move away from control-based parenting methods. He's also the founder of the website dailygroove.com, where he shares his practical parenting insights. I am really excited to dive into his unschooling and parenting experience. So to get us started, Scott, can you share with us a bit about you and your family?
Sure, and I need to update my bio here because a couple months ago my eldest turned 20, so I can no longer say I have two teenagers.
I was wondering when the last time you updated that was.
But anyway, yeah. So I live in Portland, Oregon, and that is a good place to be weird. I don't know, but we sort of have a reputation for having lots of weirdos here, and we like it that way because we don't get too many raised eyebrows about being alternative and unconventional, because it's sort of conventional to be unconventional here. And so, we can nurse in public. Well, I can't, but my wife could when the kids were nursing, and that was never a problem. And unschooling, the same sort of thing. It seems like everyone's doing something alternative here. Anyway, so my partner, her name is Beth, and we've been married now 25 years. And our kids have always been unschooling. My youngest is 16. Her name is Willow. And my eldest is 20. Her name is Olivia. I guess that's all. I could go on and on and
on. Well, we'll get you to go on and on, explaining a bit about your family's move to unschooling. So you said they've always been unschooling. Where did you first kind of hear about it, and how did you and Beth decide that's the way you wanted to go?
Well, we sort of entered parenthood completely unprepared, and so we very much made it up as we went along. I would have to say that my the spark of unschooling for me began when I was 19 years old and I dropped out of college. And I was very disillusioned with the whole education system, and I said to myself, "Damn it, I can educate myself."
Wow.
Because if there was one thing I knew I was a very curious person, and I always had followed my passions to learn about things. So I don't know if the word unschooling was even coined back then. If it was, I hadn't heard of it, and I didn't hear about it until much later. I would say, well, after our first child was born, we were trying to do things as naturally as we could. That was the guiding principles: is do things the natural way. So we had a home birth, and we learned about co-sleeping. We thought, that sounds natural. Why should we isolate our baby and make her cry for us when we can just stay close? And that led us to finding out about a book called The Continuum Concept, which a lot of unschoolers know about, which sort of looks at ancient cultures, indigenous people, hunter-gatherers, and that sort of thing, to try to get clues about what is our basic human nature. And so that led us to sort of what later became known as attachment parenting. And about for a while, we just called it continuum parenting, and we were really we became active. I actually reached out to the author of that book, and this was back in 1997, and I said, I asked her if we could put it all online, not the book, but I mean, create a community online around the book, because we really needed to share questions. This is back when, there was no Facebook, there was no Web 2.0. This is Web 1.0, and so
these are old forums,
what we did
right?
was, it was an email based on a platform called Listserv. So we started a Listserv, and that grew very large. And a lot of people who had read that book and were inspired by it wanted to talk with each other about how to apply these sort of primitive principles in a modern setting. And of course, one of the subjects that came up was education. And a lot of people talked about John Holt, because John Holt had been a fan of that book. And so we got John Holt's first book, How Children Fail, which was sort of a monumental moment in the unschooling movement. I would say for a lot of people, that's the sort of book that convinces them to jump ship from conventional education and go for self-directed education. So that's how it started. Our daughter was about nearly 2 by then. And then we said, hey, this this makes so much sense. Let's do it this way. And so we really started unschooling consciously when our first daughter was about 2. And we just never turned back.
Wow, that's really cool. It seems like, yeah, I'm here. I was just, it's such a cool journey to, were you guys in Portland at the time too? Like, how did you come across the Continuum Concept book?
Well, that's a funny story, because when our daughter was 2 months old, we were trying to do everything naturally, and we were co-sleeping and breastfeeding and all that. And then, but the one thing that didn't come to us intuitively was this idea that babies biologically, they expect to be held all the time, at least for the first few months. That's considered sort of the outer womb, or the outer gestational period. Or what Jean Liedloff calls the in-arms period. And we didn't know about that. And so every time we set our baby down, she would start to cry. And we thought there was something wrong with her. Aren't you supposed to be able to set babies down?
Yeah.
And, but she was just very intolerant of that condition. And so we went to our doctor, and fortunately we had a very, like a naturopathic type of a doctor, a woman doctor. She said, there's nothing wrong with your baby. You just need to read the Continuum Concept. And so we got the book that day, and it read it in about a day, and it was just like mind blowing. It opened up everything. Suddenly everything made sense. And we had a sort of a compass now that we could use to make decisions about how to navigate a modern world, given that we are genetically not much different than our ancient ancestors, and that we've evolved for a much different way of living and learning and growing. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, that's really cool. 'Cause I'm just sitting here kind of quietly imagining if I'd have come across any of these ideas, when my children were first born, when my eldest was first born, 'cause it was many years and all 3 of my kids were in school by the time I finally saw that first thread. Cause once you get that first thread right, then it's like, oh, this and then this. Like once you'd heard of that book, look where your path kind of went from there, right?
Yeah, it all sort of falls into place. But there is a kind of, like, people talk about deschooling being something for kids, but it's, of course, this, it's as much for adults as if not more. And fortunately, that part of it wasn't too hard for me and Beth, because we had both had kind of negative experiences with the school system. But on opposite ends of the spectrum, she had really struggled to get normal grades, and I had gotten really good grades, but I still felt like it was sort of meaningless and didn't resonate with my heart's desires. So we realized there's sort of no way to win. It's just, you just have to not play the game.
Yeah, and to know that's an option, that's awesome. I also, like you mentioned, I guess your parenting wise, you mentioned this was like before attachment parenting, but that attachment parenting thing, it's kind of come to the forefront, or is better known in the last maybe decade or so. But as you mentioned, this is all even back to the continuum concept. This is all the way parenting has been for so long, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that sort of led to my current career is that as a parenting coach, is that I noticed that a lot of people were sort of applying attachment parenting and continuum ideas on the surface and not really going very deep with it. So, for example, they would say, hey, I've been breastfeeding on demand, and I've been carrying my baby 24/7, and we don't use punishments, and et cetera, and we co-sleep. And so why isn't my child happy? Why don't we have a perfect relationship?
Mm-hmm.
And then they would describe what was not working. And it was clear to me that they hadn't looked for the underlying consciousness that is a part of, in a different value system that was a part of our ancestry. That most importantly, it's this, what I call a partnership culture. It's this idea that we're all connected. And we live in a society and a culture that really undermines that truth and makes us feel disconnected and separate and in competition with each other. And so we develop strategies of relationship that lead to lots of various kinds of power struggles and just not enjoyable relationships, especially between parents and children.
That is such a cool point, because when you think about it, from an unschooling perspective too, right? When people come and they kind of think, well, I know the quote rules of unschooling, right? No curriculum. I say yes more, and they do those things, and life becomes a little chaotic, and they're like, why isn't this working as peacefully as experienced unschoolers are explaining? And it's, again, because you have to get into the foundation, into the relationships and the roots of it, right, for it to play out that way. You can't just kind of do on the surface what the actions are. You have to have that deep understanding of it.
Right. You reminded me of a headline I saw the other day about a baby orca whale that died because it was born in captivity. And I'm sure they did all kinds of things to try to help it survive, but we're not designed by nature to survive in captivity, or to thrive. Certainly not to thrive, but in a way, the conventional ways of thinking about education create a kind of a prison that really limits us and just makes it hard to live according to our nature. And that's what I love about unschooling, is that it's working with children's nature instead of against it. But in order to do that, we have to learn a little bit about it and unlearn a lot of what we've been trained to believe about human nature and habits of thought that have come from those beliefs.
Yeah, that perfectly lines up with your point that, so much of the deschooling really is for the parents, right? Because we're the ones that have been immersed in that culture for so much longer than our kids have. And
I'm still working on it.
I know, me too. There's always
After
something,
20
right?
years. Yeah.
That leads nicely to our next question, because I want to dive into parenting with you. You have a wonderful website, dailygroove.com, where people can sign up to receive daily emails from you. As I know, I signed up early on in my unschooling journey. Now, we started back in 2002, and I really appreciated your nuggets of parenting insight. They would show up each morning, and I'd be like diving in, just like, so I had something like in the back of my mind that I could ponder for the day. You call it path parenting, and I love that not only is that an acronym, it's also a reminder that the journey, or the path, is the destination. So I was hoping you could share an overview of what path parenting is.
Sure, yeah, and it began, as I was saying before, with this realization that a lot of the parents that I was interacting with didn't seem to get the deeper aspect of the consciousness of parenting rather than just the behavior of it. And so I thought, well, you can't just tell someone to change their consciousness. You can say, do something different, but to actually think and perceive the world in a different way really takes practice, because you have been practicing your whole life seeing things a certain way, interpreting things a certain way. And so that's what gave me the idea to do the Daily Groove, which would be this idea that the way you create a groove is one pass at a time. And if you keep, if you just bit by bit, do a little bit every day to practice thinking a little differently or seeing things a little differently, then pretty soon that becomes, I guess you would say, second nature, but I would consider it more first nature. So I started that, and I thought, okay, well, it has to be has to be really brief, and because everyone's too busy, right, to read a long essay every day. So it's just a brief reminder, and my challenge, my creative challenge, which I really enjoyed, was how can I take big ideas and condense them down to under 200 or under 150 words. And I guess I must have been pretty good at that, because a whole bunch of people started sharing it and signing up for it. And that's how I knew I had hit on something that was valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that was all before I came up with this idea of this path framework. I actually had written several hundred of them when I said, okay, let's see if we can condense this even more into some set of principles that have practical value. And actually, I went and analyzed all the daily groups I had written and tried to sort of distill them to certain concepts and principles, and then group them into things. And finally, I came up with this particular grouping and tweaked it a little bit so it would make a nice acronym. But I think so PATH is an acronym that stands for what I consider the 4 positive pathways to power. And I focus on power because I found that the problems that people have the most are problems of, power struggles and or feeling disempowered, and that people, when they try to reach for their power, they tend to fall back on the habits of our society, which are generally not healthy ways of being powerful. So I tend to call that pseudo power, but authentic power really comes from these 4 pathways. So the first pathway to power is partnership. And partnership is a pathway to power through connection. So when we feel connected to each other, then it changes the way we relate in terms of our power. Instead of competing for power, we actually reinforce each other's power. And that when I feel powerful, it makes my child feel more powerful. And when my child feels more powerful, I feel more powerful. The only way that doesn't work is if we pit our power against each other. So as long as you maintain this mindset of connection, you have this really powerful pathway. So that's partnership. And then the A stands for authenticity. And authenticity is a pathway to power through alignment. And what that means is that most people have their power or their energies sort of misaligned. Like a part of me is going this way and a part of me is going that way. And or part of me wants this and a part of me doesn't want that. Another part of me is afraid or whatever. So there's all these ways in which we're out of alignment. But if you tune into what is your most authentic self, your innermost being, or who you really are, and you sort of do your best to shed all the aspects that you've picked up over the years that aren't really truly you. Things, often they're the things that, ways that you think you should be, or that people have told you, that you need to be. And when you can let those things go and connect with who you really are, then you get this alignment, and all those energies that were scattered are suddenly in the same direction, and that creates an extraordinary kind of power that's kind of it's hard to describe it. It's an abstract thing that people can feel, and for example, when you meet someone who's really what they say and what they do, it seems to be a really clear reflection of who they are. And something about that just feels really powerful. And it makes you want to align with them too. And as a child, when the parent has that kind of authenticity and alignment, it makes the child more willing to be in alignment with the parent. Mm-hmm. And it works the other way too, of course, so that parents need to learn to recognize the authenticity of their children and honor that and find ways to align with that. So does that make sense?
It really does, because just imagine that, right? You can feel like the weight and the pull of, geez, I should do this, maybe I should do that, and you feel like you don't get anywhere, right? Because your power is pulling in all different directions, rather than when you're in alignment. I mean, that image is really powerful. Like you can just feel so much more energy to accomplish things and move forward. And thinking of it in the other way with your kids, that's something that I found so much, especially those first few years, just because it was so different for me. When my kids were younger, those first few years, it was so different with them, because when they would naturally align themselves, right? They're naturally in the moment, knowing what they want to do and pursuing it. And I learned so much about how powerful and capable children are just by watching them, and I learned so much more about how to do that myself by watching them, right? It's amazing to see what that authenticity and alignment, what kind of an effect it can have in your life.
Yeah, for fun, I always encourage people to watch the movie Office Space. You ever seen that?
Yeah, no, I haven't.
It's a silly comedy, but part of the premise is that there's this guy who's kind of a loser. He's very much out of alignment with his heart's desires, and he works in a cubicle, and he hates his life. And then he sort of accidentally gets hypnotized into really what amounts to being in total alignment, totally authentic. And then it shows, how everything changes when he decides to do what's true to him. And it's very funny, of course, because he does all these things that you think would make him get fired from his job, and he ends up getting promoted, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a movie you want to watch with your kids, because there's some raunchy parts, but it is, I think it's a fun example of, because even though it was a silly comedy, there's a scene where he first has this shift. And I remember it felt so like I could viscerally feel that difference, even though, I guess it was just good acting, but that's the difference. You don't necessarily know, other than by how you feel, if you're really in that state of alignment with your authentic self.
I was just our last Q&A episode, where we take listener questions. We talked a lot about how when things are feeling off, just asking ourselves how we feel about it, how our kids feel about it, because that energy and that alignment tells us so much, right? Tells us so much about what's off in this moment and how you can get that back. So that's really interesting. And I'll definitely put that movie on my list.
You either love it or you hate it. It's like I said, it's kind of
one
raunchy,
or the
other. Anyway.
T?
T is for trust. And of course, that's a very big deal in unschooling, in self-directed education, where we've been taught very ardently by our society that you can't trust children to learn, and frankly, that you can't trust them to behave. And so, and that's the sort of the justification for all kinds of control. But the problem with not trust is not only does it justify control, but it creates all kinds of anxiety. When you're not in a state of trust, you're always worried about what's going to happen. And that's, I'm sure, a common experience with a lot of unschoolers, especially if you're new to it. It's kind of a leap of faith, and you have this anxiety. What if this doesn't work? And everybody, says that I ruined my child's life, or what if my child grows up and hates me because I didn't make him go to school, or blah, blah, blah. So there can be this anxiety that really sort of saps your power. So trust is a pathway to power through understanding. And the reason I think understanding is so important is because when you understand, for example, the true nature of the human species and how they're designed by nature to work, to learn, then it makes it possible to release those anxieties and move into a state of trust and a state of ease and inner peace. And that's particularly powerful because kids, especially younger kids, they're such emotional beings. They feel like what you say is not as important as what they feel. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a state of anxiety and not really trusting, and you're trying to be a good unschooler, but you're not really in that state of trust, the kids can feel that, and that has an effect on them, and it can lead to all kinds of unenjoyable effects. Mm-hmm. So it's really, I think of trust as being kind of a particular power that more than just other kinds of power where it sort of amplifies things. This is more about taking away the things that unamplify. I guess can't think of the word for that. that dampen our power. So a lot of power gets sort of drained from us when we are in this state of anxiety. And if we can find a way to move into trust, then it does really transform our experience and makes our kids just, they tend to respond in a very positive way. And so it leads to easier times all in all. But I like to think of trust in sort of three levels. So the first is trusting human nature, which is what we've been talking about, and how the human species is evolved to be the animal that educates itself. And I can point you to some resources to learn more about that, especially the stuff by Peter Gray. Mm-hmm. But what was I saying? The second level of trust is trusting yourself, and in particular what I call inner guidance. So this often has a lot to do with feelings and how we're sort of trained not to trust how we feel, not to trust our intuition, and instead to sort of go with authoritative exterior voices, or, you know, what some sort of research thing says or whatever. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. but if it's out of sync with what you feel in your gut, then you need to go a little deeper and ultimately, until you have that feeling in your gut that says, yes, now I understand it, and now I can relax and trust. That's an important thing to do, and it doesn't happen unless you deliberately train or retrain yourself to trust your inner guidance. Mm-hmm. And the third aspect of trust is kind of more esoteric, and I just say it's about trusting life. And this is the kind of thing where you really have to expand your consciousness to sort of see a very big picture, very long term, like not even long term like 10 years, but long term like 1,000 years or 100,000 years. And sort of trusting that life has this wisdom that you know, things work out, and you know, we can't control everything. And I think we live in an age where for many, many centuries we've been trying to see how much we can control life. And the school system is certainly one of those major areas where as a society we've gotten really elaborate in our attempts to control the life process. But I think that you know, real power comes from sort of surrendering control, and it's kind of a Zen way to think of it, but, you know, really just to move into that space of saying, I trust life. And that can even be sort of confronting big, scary things like death. Mm-hmm. You know, like can you trust life enough to allow your child to take certain risks that could kill them? Anytime you let your child wander outside your front door and be more of a free range kid, you are taking that risk. And of course, if you keep them overprotected, that actually, it's now understood that actually makes children less safe because they don't learn how to manage their own safety. Mm-hmm. So you need to move into trust to whatever degree it takes to minimize, helicopter parenting and that sort of thing.
I mean, that one hits home because I remember all that, going through that process myself when my daughter, she just turned 18 and she wanted to go to New York City and live there on her own, right? So there was all these, fears and everything that was coming up for me. And I had to get to the space where, it was reminding myself about the trust in our relationship, about, who she is, and how important this was to her, and how I could, set up the environment as much as I could, like help her find a place to stay, et cetera, and set up communication and all that stuff. But to get to a point to trust that and when I could look at things through her eyes, from her perspective, and see, why this was important to her, truly understand that, like you were talking about, when you have that understanding, you can really get to that level of trust. So that was when you're talking about, because death was a fear, right? Mm-hmm. a younger person living on their own in New York City, and we're in Canada, so it was, it got to that point. I had to take myself to that point where, what if the worst happened? Right?
Yeah. And I would say I go to that point on a regular basis. I mean, mm-hmm. even, because we're not saying, to trust life is just to be blindly faithful and just
exactly.
to never think about safety or anything like that.
Yeah.
So there are certain reasonable precautions that make sense. But at the end of the day, things, can I say this? Shit happens, and exactly. You can't control it all. You just can't, something's going to happen that there's no way you possibly could have predicted it or prevented it, other than, living in a complete, enclosed safety bubble of some kind, which is not really living. So yeah, every time my kids go out, there's just this little tiny part of me that's like I have to remember to trust life, that, mm-hmm. Fate could take my child away from me now, and I have to sort of accept that that's part of the bargain of being alive, is mm-hmm. that, we could all die at any point. And once you get good at making peace with death, it makes it pretty easy to trust just about anything. And then it's just a matter of what are the reasonable precautions that allow us to find the right balance between safety and freedom and openness and spontaneity and all that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great way to put it.
So we have one more pathway. The H is for heart, and heart is a pathway to power through unconditional love. And I could have just called it unconditional love, but then it would have spelled Patu. So, but unconditional love is kind of like, I consider it, this particular pathway to power is like magic more than any of the others, because it's unconditional love is everyone's power to create something from nothing. And you can, in other words, one of the ways that we get disempowered in this society is that we're trained to sort of withhold love and only open to love when certain conditions are met. That's what conditional love is. So it's like, if you get good grades, I feel more love for you. That's sort of a typical schooling attitude. you get more evidence of my love for you when you behave correctly or when you jump through the right hoops. And the problem with that is that if those particular hoops don't work for the child and aren't and the child resists it, then your love is sort of held hostage. Your heart is held hostage. And so unconditional love is this superpower that we have where we can just decide for no reason at all to open our hearts and say, I love you, period. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty extraordinary thing. It sounds pretty simple or maybe a little pie in the sky, but my experience has been like when it feels the most magical is when I'm in the middle of an argument with one of my kids or with my wife, and then at some point there's this little voice in the back of my head that says, you could just stop. You could just stop being so defended and just open your heart for no reason at all, even though this person hasn't given you an excuse to open those doors. You can just open them because that's your power to do so. And when you do that for no reason at all, it's like you created something from nothing. And I've had the experience of it being like almost like this sort of bizarre, mystical, magical thing where it's like, what just happened? Mm-hmm. Were we fighting? It just sort of dissolves, it disappears. And I'm not saying that you don't need to work things out, and that sometimes even arguing can be a healthy thing, but most of the time when we argue, it's because we're holding on to something, we're attached to something that we're really inappropriately placing more value on being right than enjoying our connection with each other. And so the superpower of unconditional love just says, you know what? I'm going to open my heart to you just because I can.
I really love the way you've. That's a great setup. That whole system that you went through your stuff and found those threads in them, because they align so well with all the threads that I've found over the years, coming at it from an unschooling perspective and the kind of parenting that supports that, right? Because it's all about aligning with human nature, how we are as human beings, isn't it?
So true, so true.
Yeah, I love that. And then the other, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's also simple. Like it seems like, wow, that's really powerful information, but really all it is just being real. It's just like it's the way we were meant to be. And it's just when you take away all of the different distortions, what you get is this incredible, powerful, beautiful humanity. And that's what, again, is so wonderful about unschooling, is it gives you the freedom to really go there to the best of your ability.
And like you said, you do find these almost magical times because, when you manage to use that trust, whether it's, releasing our needs to be right or whatever in an argument, or in just, your kid's doing something that's making you uncomfortable and you'd really like them to change and do it your way or whatever. But when you manage to take yourself out of those moments and just trust and be open to it, it's just amazing, places that you could never have predicted. Like if you stretch your comfort zones, where things go. And when you were talking about how understanding leads to trust, if you can take kind of that leap of faith a few times and see where things go, you start to understand the beauty and the magic of that simplicity of just kind of releasing. And it's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It really is. It feels like the greatest adventure to me. Mm-hmm. I'm, every day, every time I interact with someone who's sort of, especially other parents who are sort of having to deal with the school system and all the ways that it restricts their lives and all the ways that it undermines their their children's happiness, and then by indirectly their whole family's happiness and ease of life, then I'm just like so grateful that we chose this path. It's just so much easier. And there are definitely challenges, and we might want to talk about some of those, but overall, you have this power to flow with life and allow all of the good gifts of life to really come to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think our next questions are going to dive into some of those challenges. So how about we move on?
Sure.
We talk quite a bit in unschooling circles about communicating openly with our children and how that facilitates that connection and trust in our relationships. But some kids aren't big verbal communicators, so when we're trying to have a conversation and they're just not talkers. And I really wanted to talk a bit about it's not that they aren't giving us messages, giving us clues. It's just that not a lot of them are verbal. So I was hoping you could share some of the other ways that we can communicate and connect with our children if we find ourselves in that situation.
Sure. I'm a really big fan of nonverbal communication. And part of that is because it just as a sort of a rebellion against this overbalance that we have in our society on things that are logical and word based. And there are a lot of different kinds of communication that are nonverbal and I wouldn't say illogical, but non-logical, that are more feeling based, more intuition based, and that tends to be minimized in our society, and so we tend to over rely on verbal communication, and it taps into this issue of control that we've been talking about, because one of the things that words are really good at is controlling. That's why we have lawyers and legal contracts that, with all kinds of words that are designed to exact control over people. And that can be a good thing. I'm definitely not opposed to words. I love words and I love writing and all that. But I think just because of the culture that we live in, we need to go out of our way to develop these other channels of communication. One of the daily groups I wrote was called The Power of Silence. And what inspired that particular message was something that just happened when my wife got laryngitis when our kids were young. And so she decided not to talk for a couple of days to rest her voice and let it heal. And I was just observing that whole process, how it changed the dynamic and the subtleties of communication that were happening that had to take over. It's kind of like when a person goes blind, their hearing gets better, and when you decide to talk less, your other forms of communication become more developed and nuanced. So I find this to be a particularly important concept when you're talking about very young children, because I've seen a lot of parents who talk endlessly to their toddlers, and if you never talk to them, of course that would do them a disservice, because they need to learn the language by listening to you talk. But if you talk to them or at them too much, then I think it does tend to overwhelm them, and they begin to tune you out. Particularly, there are some children who seem to be born with more verbal skills, or more, a temperament for that sort of ability. But I would say that most kids under about 3, maybe 2, are a lot of the ways that we communicate with them verbally would be better done non-verbally. And that means through touch, through empathy, through just sort of intuiting, paying attention, watching the body language, um, being authentic with your own presence, and so that your body language communicates to them. I mean, it's I think it's more important to, like, if you, for example, if you just go into your heart and really just do whatever inner process would really open your heart to your child, and then you just sort of sit there or stand there and behold your child, and you're making eye contact, the child can feel that. They can feel the I love you in that. You don't have to say I love you. And if you say I love you, but you don't have that congruent body language, it starts to make the I love you meaningless. Does that make sense?
It really does. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really think we need to challenge ourselves to look for these other ways to communicate. And you can turn it into a game, like we sort of did when my wife had laryngitis. It's like it became a game to sort of figure out what we all needed to communicate, or what she needed to communicate without words. And so it's actually a game that I've encouraged some people to do. It's like, take a day and tell your kids you're going to play a game where you pretend you can't talk and that you're going to communicate in other ways. And kids love that, because then they get to just have this really beautiful feeling-based communication with you, where you can feel each other and you don't need to put it in words. It's almost a romantic notion, isn't it? It's like, what I love about our relationship is that you always know what I'm feeling and thinking. But I do think that it is. I mean, that's what intimacy is, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you made such a great point before, and I've seen it so many times that our children can feel what we're feeling. Like, they can feel our body language, when we're saying, okay, sure, you can watch that show, right? When our whole body is like screaming, no, 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 they can pick up on that. So, they're not reacting from what we're saying. They are reacting from all the communicating we're doing, all that's in our body language. They're like, oh, they're gonna, in that particular example, they could easily be thinking, oh, geez, I better stay here and watch as much as I can, because, I can tell from their body language that they're soon going to explode and tell me I can't go near the TV or whatever again. You know what I mean? They can just pick up so much from that. So I think your idea of purposefully not talking for a bit, just to see how to focus more on how we're communicating with all the rest of it, would be a really, really fun challenge.
The other thing is that sometimes when we talk, our brains sometimes are ahead of our hearts in a way. Mm-hmm. And so we know what to say before we know if it's the right thing to say. And if you pause before you talk and just sort of check in with your heart, a lot of the time your heart will say, you don't really need to say that. It's like, maybe what you're going to say is true, but you don't need to say it.
Yeah. And when you give more space, when you're not speaking, it just gives space for things to unfold more naturally, right? You're exerting less control over the conversation. And oh my gosh, so many times I've discovered, where my kids were going. When you give them that openness and that space to make the next connection and the next connection, you see where their mind was going. And it was totally different than all the places my mind was going to take them if I, jumped in and said X, Y, and Z, let's do this, let's do that. I'm trying to support them and help them. And I'm like, oh, getting all excited for them. But really, their mind was going in a totally different direction. So cool.
Yeah, and another thing that comes to mind is that this nonverbal communication is something that has been observed by anthropologists in hunter-gatherer cultures, where they rely much more on what one anthropologist calls intuitive rapport, rather than talking things out. And so his name is Richard Sorensen, and there's this wonderful essay he wrote called Pre-Conquest Consciousness. And one of the stories he tells is of a group of teenage boys who are hunting together, and he observed them sort of acting like, obviously they couldn't talk because they didn't want to scare away the monkey they were trying to shoot out of a tree. But he saw them communicating non-verbally and how they could all feel each other. He described a situation where, as one person was pulling back the bow, another person was pulling back a branch that was in the way of the path of the arrow, and someone else was moving into position to catch the monkey when it fell or whatever. I don't remember all the details, but it described this really extraordinary kind of nonverbal communication. So it's, in a way, that's like dancing, it's a body-oriented communication is a very important part. If you're going to dance with someone, you need to lead and follow and feel each other. And then this another observation he made was that, like, even with toddlers, as the toddlers start to explore farther and farther away from the caregiver, the toddler would just glance at the caregiver as he or she was moving in that direction. And if the caregiver was nervous about where the toddler was going, the toddler would just feel it. Like the caregiver didn't have to say, "Don't go there, that's dangerous." They didn't have to verbalize this sort of fear and amplify it. It was just an intuitive feeling that was shared between two individuals. I do think that age makes a difference. And so, like I said, when you have really young kids, that's when I think it's most important to have lots of, to develop this nonverbal channel. And then as they get older, I can certainly tell you in my family with older kids, we talk and work things out verbally all the time. And my wife and I are constantly processing stuff. And it's just, maybe that's because of our culture. Like, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it can be very stressful on a very young child.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I guess we should probably move on to the next question.
Sure.
You have a great article on your website about holding presence with negative feelings such as frustration or fear. And I was hoping you could share what you mean by holding presence and how we can work to develop that skill.
So you're referring to an article I wrote called "Ending the Blame Game," where I first mentioned that term. I sort of just made it up, this idea of holding presence, because it's just how I described what I was doing when I was able to transcend that game. And of course, blame is sort of a catch-all word for a lot of different kinds of inspiring, unpleasant interactions between people. I would say that blame is a kind of a catch-all for a lot of different things that are unpleasant, like judgment and accusation and righteous, one-upmanship, that kind of stuff. But it all sort of boils down to it's something that we do. Then it begins innocently enough as just something in you feels off. You feel like there's something wrong. You can't quite you don't necessarily immediately put your finger on it. But what we tend to do, what we've been trained to do, is that you immediately look for something to blame for that feeling. It's like, in other words, if I could get mad at the weather, or I could get mad at the traffic. The traffic is making me feel this way. And you blame, but it's basically, you have this feeling in you that something is wrong, and that kind of turns into something is wrong with me, and I need to get rid of it. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to be the cause of this bad thing, so I need to assign the badness somewhere else. And that's basically what we're doing when we're blaming. Holding presence is an alternative to that particular dynamic, because when you assign blame to someone else or something else, two bad things happen. One is that you sort of destroy that relationship or undermine it. And the other thing that happens is you basically give your power away, because now that other person is making you feel bad rather than you staying connected to your own power to create positive feelings in yourself. So if you are willing to hold presence with that feeling that something is wrong, instead of passing it on to someone else, then you get this, you open to this process of transformation. In other words, the feeling of wrongness is actually there to teach you something. And if you can stay with it, often it'll teach you something like, oh, I'm holding a false belief, or I'm worrying about something that isn't even real. It's just an illusion, or it's just a fear based on something I learned from the media or whatever. So if you can stay with it, then you get those insights, and that either will tend to make the negative feeling go away or just sort of dissolve, or it will transform into something more empowering, like determination. If you feel anger, often that will transform into determination, and you use that energy to do something positive. So that's what I mean by holding presence. And the example that I use in the article is that you can practice holding presence by doing something intentionally, just as a kind of a game, doing something intentionally that you normally would try to avoid, that you would normally think of as bad. And the example that I use is getting in the shower deliberately with the water too cold. Because most people who are sensitive to that sort of thing will, if they step in the shower and they weren't expecting it to be cold and it's cold, it's like this very almost angry feeling about it.
Yeah.
And the water shouldn't be cold. This is a shower. The water is supposed to be warm,
Stomp.
And who used up all the water? It's like that.
Yeah.
But if you do it deliberately and you step into that slightly too cold shower and you notice your body saying it shouldn't be this way, and at the same time you're just practicing, well, it is this way. I just am approaching it with acceptance. I'm just willing to make peace with reality, with what is. And when you do that, that's basically holding presence. And it will teach you something. For example, it might teach you that, oh, I can handle cold water. It's not that big of a deal. Or I actually can see where this might be pleasurable to occasionally experience a new variety of temperature. You know what I mean? So it's just a silly exercise, but we take these things for granted. And they pile on. There's so many things that we think things should be this way. And then when they aren't, we look for someone to blame. And that's no fun.
Yeah. No. Yeah, there were so many good things in that. But that is such a cool example, just to feel what it's like to stay with it, right? Rather than, like you said, assign the blame, shift the blame, because when we do that, at first we're like trying to I don't know, make ourselves feel better, right? Shift that blame somewhere else. But you're actually giving away power that way, aren't you? Because then all of a sudden that thing has the power over you to make you angry and frustrated. So, maybe it's the hot water tank, right?
Right.
The size of the hot water tank. But, in anything, you're giving them that power so that moving forward, you don't feel in control. You feel like all these things in your life, the traffic, the weather, the hot water tank, the everything have so much control over your life, and you'll have lost that. Whereas when you can stay with it, I think there's so much more self-awareness that you can find in there, and you realize you have so much more power and control. That's what you're talking about, it feeling so much more empowering, right? Because you
Yeah.
realize that it's all within your days, are all within your control. Those are just things that happen, not things that have, like when you blame it, all of a sudden you've given it power over you. That's
Right.
so interesting. Yeah.
And you sort of pointed out a paradox here by saying your days are within your control, because we're talking about letting go of control. And in doing so, there's a sort of a higher level of control. In other words, it's one thing to try to control life, to control the weather, to control nature, to control your children. It's another thing entirely to acknowledge that you do have the power to control your inner world, to the extent that you can decide what perspective you're going to take, and notice that when I take this perspective, I feel shitty. And when I take that other perspective, I feel more powerful and peaceful. And so it's my choice. I'm free to choose that perspective. And that's very powerful. And in a way, it is a kind of control, but not in the domineering way.
Traditional sense. Yeah, it's like when you realize you don't need to control all these things around you, you feel so much more centered and for lack of a better term, in control of yourself, right? It is quite the paradox, but it's really it does feel so empowering. Maybe power is the best word. Release control, feel power.
Yeah, and I talk about a distinction between pseudo power and authentic power. So pseudo power is what you get in normal types of control strategies that we use. And it's not really powerful because it's always just fleeting, and you end up having to defend it. So it drains you even more. But authentic power is just, it's sort of tapping into these aspects of life that are already naturally and infinitely powerful. Especially love is this infinite power that it's why we have this magical power to create it from nothing, because there's an unlimited supply. It's just all you have to do is decide.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Let's talk a little bit more about how easy it is to slip into control. As our children get older, we touched on this a little bit before. We can sometimes find ourselves feeling uncomfortable with some of their choices, the things that they're pursuing and that feel really good to them. And when we start feeling that fearfulness, we start to feel protective of them. And that's when we can so easily slip into control, because that is what we live with, right? That's the go-to response of our culture. You know, your parents' job is to say, no, sorry, you can't do that. And then impose some consequences. Say, if I find that you're doing X, you're going to lose this privilege or whatever if they disobey. So I just thought we could talk a bit about how that can damage your relationship, that trust, that connection, and what we might do instead when we're starting to feel overly protective and fearful.
Wow, that's really big. I mean, I think the word consequences is ripe for deconstruction, and it is one of the most disingenuous words in the whole parenting lexicon, because people talk about consequences when they're really talking about a punishment. It's just a way to control people. And I always say the only authentic consequence is love, right? It's like, whatever you do, I love you, period. That's the consequence. And what that means is that if you behave in a way that I don't like, then that means we need to tend to the partnership. This is why I think partnership is one of the most central concepts that I talk about in being with children. And unschooling really is a kind of partnership education. You're partnering with the child and with their nature. But in a behavior situation, rather than, sort of the old view is that the child is supposed to behave a certain way, and I have the right to control that. And if you're in a partnership orientation, say, well, we each have equal dignity. Obviously, we're not equal in every way. I'm older, more experienced, and I have more legal rights, et cetera, et cetera. But as human beings, we're equal, and I have no more right to control my child than my child has a right to control me. But we're not particularly interested in controlling each other. We're interested in having an enjoyable partnership. And that does mean that we are interacting and we are, it's not so much controlling each other as doing a dance together. Right. And that means we need to be attuned with each other. We need to understand each other's needs. And we need to be first and foremost, I think we need to just sort of be committed to being creative, because it's inevitable that there are going to be situations where what I want and what my child wants are not the same thing. And then it looks like a win-lose situation. And when it looks like that, we have the power to choose a different perspective, that it doesn't have to be win-lose. It can be win-win. And I like to say it's a win-win-win, because I win, you win, and the partnership wins. The partnership gets stronger. But that, in order to create those win-win outcomes, you really have to be committed to a creative process. That every time we seem to be at odds, it's an opportunity to be co-creators and to step into a collaborative process, I guess. And that's, if we can avoid the reactivity and the tendency to move into blame and just sort of hold presence long enough to calm ourselves down, then we can actually move into that creative process and really enjoy it and say, well, okay, wait a minute. Sorry, I overreacted. What I really want to understand is, what are you needing here? And I want you to understand what I'm needing here. And let's just assume that in this universe of infinite possibilities, there is at least one possibility where both of us meet our needs, or both of us satisfy our desires. And those creative possibilities that you discover in that process can often be, better than what you wanted in the first place. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's just different, or maybe it's even a little bit inferior in terms of like what would have been perfectly ideal for you. But on the bigger picture, it's a better outcome because you have this stronger partnership. And that pays off big time in the long term. I like to say that, if your kids are still young and you commit yourself to cultivating a partnership culture in your family, then you have, plenty of years to do it. And by the time they're teenagers, you don't have any of the problems, or very little of the problems that are typical of teenagers. If you've made that effort. And I'm not saying that we've had no problems, but definitely not some of the horror stories that I hear, or some of the sad situations that I see where young adults and their parents don't like each other.
Yeah, no, I think so much of what we've been talking about this whole time leads up to this, right? Because it's that when you're feeling the urge to control, I think that's a great point to try and see that as a clue that it's time to refocus back on partnership, right? And that reminds you, okay, it reminds you to look at the situation from their perspective, from their eyes, and not even from like what I would do in their situation, because I'm not them.
Right.
It's to see the whole situation from inside them, right? From their perspective, why this is important to them. Because once you have that understanding of where they're coming from, at least, you can bring that like to your whole co-creation conversation. That's how you guys how we can find a path forward as partners where we're all reasonably satisfied. Like you said, it may not be like the perfect, but when we can find something where we're all like, yeah, okay, I can live with that. I can do that. That works. I love that third win, because that's when the partnership becomes more solid, becomes again another layer of connected and trusting, because you have again found a way through this. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to think about it as a win-win-win.
Totally. And I would even go a step further for those who are adventurous in the realms of consciousness, that you can actually, I mean, what you said, I think is true, to say, well, what would I do, or what would I want? And then to remember, well, but I'm not her, or I'm not him.
Yeah.
But on a deeper level, you can actually say, I am her, like in a sort of more esoteric, new agey, we're all one kind of thing.
Yeah.
And and if you cultivate that consciousness of oneness, and it's a sort of a paradox, we're separate and we're connected, right? But we tend to focus in our culture more on the separateness and not that much on the connectedness. So you can actually play thought games and decide, okay, for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to fully wholeheartedly inhabit the perspective of my child. And, if they love something that I think is meh, I'm going to love it. Right. And just feel that. And that opens you up to discovering deeper kinds of connection, but also even just things where, my opinion about that one thing wasn't fully informed. Now that I've totally stepped into my child world, I have a greater appreciation for that.
Oh, so many times when I've done that, like when I felt uncomfortable, and then it's like, okay, so where is this? And putting myself, you can think of it that way as us being one, but putting myself in their spot, so many times I was able to stretch my comfort zone, is kind of how I've talked about it before, because all of a sudden it's like, wow, those pieces that I was bringing into my thoughts, or maybe they were some stereotypes that I picked up, or some negative experience that I had, those were clouding my vision, and my perspective grew just by taking the time to see it how they see it. And often, regularly enough anyway, the whole kind of problem dissolved, because I realized it was just me stretching a little bit to really see them.
Right. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very cool. Okay, last question. You are also a founding member of the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, which advocates for both unschooling and alternative schools that support self-directed education. And I love that when I first went there, last year when your website was up, I loved the phrase normalize self-directed education as a whole. I thought that was such an amazing purpose, just to get it out there for people to know that this exists and that it is a viable option. So I was wondering if you'd like to give us an update on the work that the Alliance is doing now.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, definitely our goal is, it started out as a group called the Tipping Points Group, and it was just a bunch of people that really, really wanted to see our culture, our society reach a tipping point where there's a shift into the idea that self-directed education is just as valid, if not more valid, or more effective in comparison to traditional schooling, and that it's just sort of a known thing. Like, wouldn't it be cool if everyone grew up knowing that that's a choice? We don't have to send our kids to school or to a conventional school. We can send them to one that really honors their nature, or we can homeschool them in a way that honors their natural educative instincts. And so a lot of what we're doing really is advocacy and public relations, and trying to build bridges, not only between us and the mainstream, but also between the different sort of we sometimes call it the different flavors of self-directed education, so, which includes the free schools and unschooling, and there's different flavors of unschooling, and and sometimes we focus too much on these differences. We really want to focus on what we all have in common, which is that we want a world where children are free to learn naturally and free to learn without the sort of impediments that are that come along with standard imposed schooling. So that's our main mission, and we've been building a structure to support that a bit at a time, because it's just sort of a mostly volunteer in a shoestring budget so far, unless somebody if somebody out there wants to donate a very large sum, I'd like to talk to you,
You'd
because
be welcome.
the more we are interested in fundraising to create some really more impactful initiatives that reach more people and get the word out even more effectively. So where are we? I guess before I say that, I wanted to say that a lot of unschoolers, including myself, have been allergic to the word education, and I think that has a lot to do with because when most people think of education, they just think of schooling or the school system, and in the initial formative period of this group, we were going to use the term self-directed learning, which is a fairly common term used among some unschoolers and free schoolers. So, and then Peter Gray, who's one of the main founding members, he came one day and said, I think we should use the word education instead of learning. And he's sort of a professor of psychology, and he understands some of the nuances of the terminology in a way that is different from the conventional assumptions that people have about that word. And so we actually had this really long debate. I was sort of the opposition, because coming from the unschooler perspective, I really just that word made me cringe, and it just sort of had so much baggage on it. And eventually, Peter made a really strong case for why that word education is better if we understand it in a different way. That education is not the same thing as schooling, but education is really a whole life process of acquiring knowledge and values and skills that are conducive to a satisfying and meaningful life. And the word school is not in that definition. So, I'd say that's congruent with another term that some people like, which is life learning. But this idea of education is something that from an anthropological or psychological perspective, it is something that is required of a human being because we're a cultural animal, and education is this process by which we acquire our culture and our ability to use all the tools of the culture, including language and knowledge and other in technology and such. So I was eventually convinced that, okay, fine, let's use education. Let's use the word education, but let's make it a part of our mission to redefine education so that when we talk about it, we make it clear that we're not talking about schooling and all the trappings of schooling. We're talking about this natural life process of following your curiosity and being playful and acquiring knowledge through exploration and all that. And yes, that can include some formal schooling, as many unschoolers do choose for themselves. But it's not imposed. It's never imposed. It's always something that comes from personal freedom with the support of parents and community. So that's what we mean when we talk about self-directed education. And we didn't even really have the debate about the word self-directed, because I know that's a debate sometimes in like with the word child-led. People don't like that term, and it sounds a little similar. But really what we mean by self-directed is that it's sort of in contrast to teacher-directed or school system-directed. That the ultimate arbiter of the path is the person who is educating himself or herself. And that means that we're not going to impose anything on them. We may very well influence them and offer enriching experiences and strew things and all that other kind of stuff that we do, but never to the point of putting pressure or denying them the right to say no or no thank you or maybe later. So it's really about honoring the child's right to be the final arbiter of their educative process, which when they're really young, of course, it's almost like, like a 2 or 3 year old, you kind of function very much in sync with each other. It's not, we're not suggesting that a self-directed education means that, a 2-year-old is going to decide whether or not, the family has a vacation or whatever. But, but you do, it's about that maintaining that partnership. And one of the principles of partnership is that you work with each other, not dominate each other. So just wanted to say that in case people were wondering, why do we call it self-directed education? That's why it's the best that we could come up with for something that will help build this bridge so that, we don't want to take away anything from the beauty and the fun of the word unschooling, but we also want to have terminology that people who are kind of still have one foot or maybe both feet in that control-oriented culture can wrap their brains around. What is this? It is education, and it is different because it's not directed by teachers and educators. It's directed by the child.
Oh yeah. Oh, I loved hearing a little bit about the history. That's really interesting, and I can definitely see how that that term does self-directed education does seem like a bridge term, right? That's not going to get that initial negative reaction, but it's going to be, that unschooling. I mean, go read the comments on any unschooling article, right? It's just, that initial burst of whatever But yes, that's a bridge work because education is a word kind of that they know, right? And self-directed is what's going to raise the question, like, well, what does that mean? So I think it does really help facilitate some more connection and conversation. And like you said, I love how you explain that it always goes back to that partnership, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my hope, this isn't necessarily part of the alliance, but my hope is that that we will evolve this culture to the point where we don't even call it self-directed education. We might, if you're an academic, you might refer to it as education. And
Yeah.
but even better would, just an everyday person wouldn't even think of it as a thing. It's just living. And if you're living, you're learning and growing and developing your potential. That's just a part of life. And to have that sort of like where education is to a person like water is to a fish, if you're a fish, water isn't a thing. It's just what's everywhere.
Right. And so often, go back and look at my blog post because ultimately every time I'll go through and, explaining some concept or whatever, at the end, it's always unschooling is life. It's just living, right? Yeah, no, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful dream too,
Right. And it's fun to imagine what's possible with a society that really gets the power of self-directed education and that we could design the structures of society to support that instead of these control structures where we can imagine all kinds of, the resources that are currently put into control-based schooling could be put into things like libraries that go beyond just books and other media, but that are places where people gather to explore all kinds of things, more like community centers that have all sorts of enrichment opportunities and a place where people gather so that we have social opportunities as well.
Exactly. So it's not like an age-based thing, right? Where kids go somewhere to learn. It's having places in society, like you said, community structures where everyone can go learn, be in relationship with each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No.
That takes away the control aspect and the controlling others aspect and the whole age thing where, kids have to learn and adults get to live. Everybody's living and learning together.
Beautifully said. Now you're talking about my utopia.
Mine too. That's beautiful. Well, I must say, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Scott. We went a little bit long, but I had so much fun chatting with you.
Me too. This has been really fun.
Oh, that's awesome. And before we go, where's the best place for people to connect with you online?
Dailygroove.com is the best place to find my work, and I have links there to some of my other work. So I do offer coaching sessions for parents who want support to sort of make that shift. Sometimes it's really hard and you have to dig a little deeper to shift out of the old control paradigm into the partnership system. So that's certainly something that I'd like to help people do. And you can find information about that on that website and some others that are linked from it. And then, of course, I invite people to subscribe to the Daily Groove, and you get a few times a week, you get these short reminders that you can use to just boost your consciousness a little bit every day and practice living in this new paradigm. And I think that's
awesome.
Of course, the Alliance is a lot of my effort is going into that right now and helping them. We're creating more resources on the website, and that website is selfdirected.org with a hyphen between self and directed. So that's something that you can become a member of and get sort of involved in the movement. We're going to be building we're going to be working with people who are allies in the movement, and there's always someone who's just doing it, but then there's someone who is like, they want to make it, like they want to advance the movement for everyone. And I would consider you to be one of those people. And so we'll be inviting people like you to participate in combining our efforts and our creativity toward advancing this movement and making self-directed education a normal and legitimate path. We already know it's a normal and legitimate path. I mean, to everyone else.
Let other people know. That's awesome, Scott. And I will definitely put links to all that stuff in the show notes. That's terrific. And thank you so much again. Have a wonderful day.
I will. Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to connect with you and your listeners.
I hope you found this episode helpful on your unschooling journey. And be sure to check out the growing podcast archive. The conversations never go out of date. You can find more information about my books, the Living Joyfully Network online community, and the Childhood Redefined Unschooling Summit online course at my website, livingjoyfully.ca.